Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenanti's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenanti's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here, speaking from the Polar Vortex, the second day of the Polar Vortex here in Chicago. Man, it was crazy cold. Today we've got two episodes for you, so if you're only catching this one, make sure you look at the feed and check out the other interview, which is with Dennis Kitchen, talking about the history of underground comics, his association with Will Eisner. Fascinating conversation. Underground comics, really, just like how did they make them, and really a lot of ties to creator-owned comics today in terms of the way that Dennis and a lot of the underground comic people operated. So a really interesting conversation. But this one that you're listening to right now, this is with Jason Sachs. Now, Jason has written the history of the 90s in comics for Twomorrows and their Comic Book Chronicles, an excellent series of books that feature a look at each comic book decade from the 40s to the present, and the 90s is one of the recent volumes. It is great. It's a wonderful, very detailed look at every big company and small company, boom and bust. We all know the roller coaster ride that the 90s was for comic books, the speculation market, a lot of great comics. Sometimes the 90s get maligned for the product, and really, especially if you read Jason's book, you're going to realize how many great comics actually did come out in the 90s. And again, every decade, if you're an adolescent, that's your favorite decade. I know Kirkman, of course, big 90s fan. Oh, that was his decade, man. That's when he was a teenager and loving comic books. So I get it. And it was really fun talking to Jason about the book. It is incredibly detailed. They talk about the changes in the direct market, the moves that Marvel made to have its own distributorship, and how it killed a couple distributors like Capital City and others, and kind of helped form where we are today in the direct market with Diamond as the lone survivor of the 90s. So a very interesting roller coaster ride from boom to bust of the 90s with Jason Sachs on today's Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you, League, for your support. Man, a lot of people have really come through, and I've got new subscribers. It helps a lot, League. I appreciate the support. Thank you very much. If you'd like to subscribe to Word Balloon, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon or the front page and click on the Patreon ad at wordballoon.com. But truly, thank you for your support, League of Word Balloon listeners. All right, let's get into our conversation now. The history of comics in the 90s now on Word Balloon. Jason Sachs, welcome to Word Balloon, and congratulations on this fine book, another edition of the American Comic Book Chronicles. I've been paying attention, and you're tackling a very fun decade, the 90s.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's a very fun decade to write about. There's just so much that happened during that time frame. I mean, we all know about the hollow foil covers and the amazing early Image ripoffs and Rob Liefeld's unbelievable artwork, but also a great decade if you're interested in the rise and fall of the comic book industry in terms of sales. We've certainly never seen sales at anywhere close to the numbers that we saw in the early 90s, and then the amazing fall of the industry in the second half of the decade. Some of the greatest comic art came out during that time, and some of the worst. And it was a treat to write about it.
It's true, man, and you're right. I'll be honest, I checked out about halfway through the decade and didn't come back until 99 because, and this will be my personal moment, but yeah, the art kind of dominated the story. and it like I felt like the stories were getting dumber, and so really like I remember like certainly I bought Marvels and I certainly bought Kingdom Come, and I think it was Kingdom Come like 95 or 96.
95, yeah.
Oh, 95. Okay, good. Then I like spent about 4 years not paying attention and then hearing that, hey, Daredevil's good again and Kevin Smith's writing it. And I'm like, oh, well, I know he's a comic book fan. Maybe it's all right. So I picked up his Daredevil, and then that's when I discovered Rucka and Brubaker and Bendis in 1999. And I'm like, oh, the writing's good again. Okay, and I was more of a, I want to hear what you think, but I was more of a DC guy than a Marvel guy. So I really did miss. It's funny. I would go through quarter bins and sometimes be like, oh, there's an interesting little Shang-Chi miniseries from like 1998. Let me check it out. And then I'd read it and be like, oh, never mind. So
this isn't as good as I remember it being.
Yeah. So tell me about, like, again, we're gonna get into detail, but yeah, I don't know. Like, were you consistent throughout the decade for yourself as a fan?
No, I went in and out myself too. I had little kids during that decade, so money was a little tighter than it could have been.
Sure.
But going back now as an adult and rereading this stuff, it's pretty amazing. I mean, yeah, I love a lot of the stuff that came out in the late 90s, and a lot of the stuff that came out in the late 90s really set the template for how we think of superhero comics today. Stuff like The Authority or Kurt Busiek's Avengers and Iron Man really set the pace for the movies that started coming out in the early 2000s.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But the earliest stuff, the crazy Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane books are just fun, uninhibited, wacky fun. People just throwing crap at the wall and seeing what people love. And I think that's what people responded to at the time. I mean, no one will accuse Rob Liefeld of being the greatest comic book artist, but we will accuse him of being like the guy.
Say it again,
He's
because
smiling
actually you dropped out for a second. So we got the first half of that. Do it again.
No one will accuse Rob Liefeld of being the greatest comic artist, but in terms of being the happiest or the one who has the most fun doing his work, absolutely, and you can see it in every page he drew.
Absolutely, and a lot of energy, and I think really channeled his enthusiasm into good action and a lot of energy on those pages. I agree with that. I'll be honest, other than Spawn, a lot of the Image creations just didn't speak to me, and I was just kind of older, I guess, reader that was just really satisfied with DC and Marvel. And truly, I did miss Authority the first time around. I did miss Preacher the first time around. And a lot of the really exceptional stuff that came from Vertigo and, those other places and stuff. And like I said, it really for me, like, the wake-up call was 99. And a big thing, and I know you cover it as well, is No Man's Land. That was a nice little resurgence for Batman. And I think actually first I saw the novelization that Rucker wrote, and then I went to the comic stores and I'm like, oh, look at this! It's still going. It was a comic story, and it looks like a really good comic book story. So.
Yeah, it is a great story. It starts with Cataclysm in 1998 when the earthquake hits Gotham City, and a lot of those stories around the earthquake are just great, solid human interest stories. It's Robin or someone having to save people who are stuck in that basement, and the walls are collapsing in on him, and he just does everything he can to save them. And those are great stories. And then once we get into No Man's Land, which is just this great high concept idea of what happens if you cut off Gotham City and it becomes this no man's land where their criminals run the society, it's just such a cool, clever, interesting idea. And it just is such a grabber.
A lot of personal moments, like when Batman is finally willing to reveal himself to Jim Gordon. And he's like, don't you dare. How dare you insult me? And it's like, that's his attitude. It's like, wow, what the hell's going on, man? Luthor's going to come in and buy up all the assets to Gotham. And it had some amazing twists. I'm a huge No Man's Land fan. And that, like I said, it made me a Rucka fan. And, and again, that's the end of the story. That's the end of the 90s. You cover every year as much as these comic book chronicle books have. And did you work on a previous volume as well?
I wrote the 1970s volume, and I wrote portions of the 1990 or 1980s volume.
Oh, very cool.
So, I've covered 3 different decades of it.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah,
and I read the 60s one. I was really interested in certainly the decade before I really started paying attention. And and believe me, they are on my wish list. I mean, it was nice. They sent me a review copy for the 90s. But I'm gonna have to go to Twomorrows' website and pick up the other volumes I haven't read yet, because they're incredibly extensive. It not only covers the decade from a critical standpoint, but you get into the inside baseball of the market and the numbers and how each publisher was doing and how successful some of these ideas were, whether they were critical favorites or not. You also have sales numbers to back your stories up as well, to say, yes, as fun as that was, it wasn't a big hit. And, some great runs that were cut off short because of low sales.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was the most fun part about doing this work is just picking up the old fanzines and magazines from that era. So I read every issue of Wizard magazine from the 1990s, Comics Journal, Heroes Illustrated, the old Amazing Heroes, but also like Comics Retailer magazine. And that was just an amazing revelation. For example, we're used now to thinking of Marvels as one of the greatest stories ever published.
Yeah.
Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross delivered this work that really is a masterpiece now. But at the time, people were shocked by the quality of the sales on it. First of all, it's a $5.95 book at a time that most books were $1.99. So, and no one had heard of people had heard of Busiek. He was a kind of a journeyman writer. No one had heard of Alex Ross.
That's right.
And the book just hit, and it was this boom. And there's all these kind of ecstatic comments from people. From the retailers in '93, I believe, when the book came out, like, we never expected to sell like this, but this is exactly what our fans want. And now looking back on it, it's kind of like a signal event that shows like where comics were going to go in the late '90s also, because it's about embracing what makes superheroes really interesting and important. So it was cool to get this kind of coming out of nowhere surprise, as well as just kind of see how the influence of it played out through the entire decade. So I'm not sure you could get to something like The Authority without having Marvels first.
Makes a lot of sense.
Or Kurt Busiek's Avengers without having Marvels first.
Yes, absolutely. The one that he did with, was it Perez or?
Yeah, George Perez, yeah.
Avengers Forever?
That was with Carlos Pacheco. That's a 12-issue miniseries, which is fantastic. That's so fun.
Oh, but you're just saying his regular Avengers run with George.
Heroes Return, the Avengers. He also did a great run on Iron Man at that time, too, which is so fun. I'm not sure it's ever been reprinted, but it's Tony Stark as James Bond, traveling the world and having amazing superhero adventures. It's just so fun.
Well, that's where I'm going to have to use my Marvel Unlimited account and go back and read that stuff. No, I always want to point out, because again, I had no crystal ball, but out of nowhere, my day job back in the early '90s was working at a bank, and it was the bank that Now Comics used for their accounts. And I literally was in the department where we would see all the checks that came in, to Now Comics, and it was all this stuff for Terminator, the Burning Earth, and I'm like, what is this? And then I looked it up, and that was one of Alex's first big books, and pre-Marvels and everything, and I'm like, oh. And then when I heard about Marvels, it's like, that's that Terminator artist. Okay, cool. And again, even the previews that Marvel put out of Marvels and everything looks so amazing. So now I wanted to talk to you about, because you mentioned all the comic magazines of the time, and it would be great to go back and read Comic Retailer as those years were happening, but Wizard in particular, because that was such a game changer in a lot of ways. And one of them that I find fascinating, and I got to be honest, I'm a little cynical about, was, as you point out, it challenged Overstreet in terms of offering a price guide for books, and I really think they were and I want to know what you think of this. I mean, there were a lot of contributing factors to the speculation market, where comic books were treated like baseball cards and bought like investments, and everyone thought the number ones they were buying were going to, put their kids through college or, set up their retirement accounts and all that stuff. But I really felt that Wizard was kind of ginning the numbers, and certainly with their own, like, they had that Black Bull imprint. And I don't know if that started in the 90s, but I know that it was in the early 2000s as well. 2000,
yeah.
Oh, okay, it started in 2000.
Just outside the window of our book, yeah.
Okay, but yeah, man, I'm like, hey, man, these guys are kind of, our Black Bull book, our first issue is worth $50, and it's like, yeah, to who? And I know people, because I have friends who own stores, as I'm sure you do, and they'd walk in with Wizard and be like, yeah, but it says here Invaders 4 is worth $700. And it's like, yeah, I'm not paying $700 for your Invaders 4. Get out of here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Wizard started 1991, actually killed. It had the price guide in it, and the important thing, it was on newsstands too, so people could just, ordinary people,
sure,
kids at that time, would pick it up because of the Spider-Man covers or whatever, and see that their comics worth a lot of money. And also was this really smart way of channeling people to what they called the hot artists and writers at the time.
Yes.
It really just drove the hype. There's a really interesting example of what Wizard did, actually, this kind of codependent launch. So Wizard number 7, which was early 92, had a cover feature on Valiant Comics. And Valiant had started in 1990, basically was just struggling along. But they came out with this sort of Wizard that just hyped the Valiant books like crazy, just as the Unity crossover was coming out. And for whatever reason, it really captured people's imagination. And the numbers on Unity went from relatively small numbers to massively large numbers, to the point where, like, by mid 1992, early 1993, their numbers had exploded to 10 times what they were before.
Wow.
And they believe it's the Wizard effect tied to the rise of Image Comics. Got people reading Wizard, got people reading Valiant, and got people reading the Image books, and it all became this kind of symbiotic relationship that just grew and grew and grew. And it leads to this kind of interesting thing where by 1993, there was this amazing thirst for new comics universes. So that stuff like X-Men had gimmicks every month, basically, to get by, because what people wanted to buy was Youngblood, Exo-Man, and Warren Turok.
Yep.
And so there's this feeling for a short time like the entire industry was just flipping. There's a transformation happening that didn't last for a long time, but was really tangible, and in large part kind of brought about by Wizard.
Yeah, and it's like this kind of, like you said, codependent sort of relationship with the publishers. And I know that you point out, too, that they would come out with those half issues, which was a big deal and everything as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I collected those back in the day, too.
Sure.
Yeah, and everyone loved and hated the price guide. I mean, yeah, I have friends who ran stores at the time too. Who were like, yes, Spawn number 1 was like the number 1 selling book for most of the 1990s, and they were listing Spawn 1 as like a $25 book for a while. But that book sold like 930,000 copies at wholesale. So it's literally like a dollar book. I mean, obviously, we still see it now occasionally in the quarter bin.
Oh yeah, I have a friend who's in I have a friend who's in the memorabilia business. And he's not that hip to comics, and he's like, "Oh, this guy wants to, like, I can get like half a warehouse full of like '90s comics. Should I do it?" I'm like, "No." I'm like, unless you want to wallpaper your house with old comic pages. I said, "No, absolutely not, man. They're not worth it. Don't." I'm like, "They're not even worth a cent. No, don't do it."
Turok Dinosaur Hunter number 1. With this amazing holofoil cover, actually one of the coolest covers of the 90s, sold 1.75 million copies to comic stores. And there's a belief that not even 200,000 copies were actually bought by readers.
I hear you, man. This is what I'm saying. I know that, X-Men 1, the Jim Lee book, 8
sold
million?
8.1 million.
Insane.
8.1 million. And there's retailers now who were around back in the day who still have long boxes full of X-Men 1s.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's all part of this kind of amazing boom that happened in the early 90s, where just all this money rushed in and everyone believed this stuff was going to suddenly pay for their kids' college educations. And just as quickly, it entirely evaporated. But for this very short window of time, like, comics were where it was a place to be. In 1993, there were 28 different new companies or new imprints created to sell comics.
Wow.
Marvel had a couple lines, one based on Clive Barker comics. DC launched Vertigo that year. Milestone Comics came out.
Yes.
Ultraverse came out. Comics Greatest World. All the way down to, like, Rip-Off Press created a kids imprint called Magnacom Comics. No one remembers they published Cutie Bunny comics. Like, everyone was in this gold rush.
Tops.
And then
Yeah, I love that you're
Tops,
like, Tops was, and I want you to finish your thought. But yeah, Tops went from, as you said, as they were putting trading cards in comics, it was, inevitable that Tops would be like, all right, let's get in the comic book business. And, they made good comics for a while.
There were some good comics there for a while, absolutely. And and of course then we got the whole thing of like comics being sold in bags with cards attached to them and everything.
Yes.
Because after all, it's going to make it so much more valuable if you never take it out of the bag. Then it's even better. Like wait, like does it not matter how good? No, it's just like cool speculation. This is going to pay for my kids. This is going to pay for my mortgage. Well, good luck with that.
Well,
good luck with that.
And truly, again, that's one of the reasons why I checked out, because they were collectibles, and it's like the word is comic book, or the compound word is comic book, and it's like I want to be able to read this. Don't tell me I can't open the bag because I'm going to devalue it. And then when you did and you read it, it's like, well, that certainly wasn't worth buying. What the hell? And again, that's why I checked out. But and also you really get into the whole. No, please finish your thought, please.
You did miss out on a lot of good stuff, though. I mean,
I did. You're right.
Throughout the entire decade. I mean, I mentioned Valiant Comics earlier. The early Valiant books are really good. What they call the pre-Unity Valiant books, Rye, Exo-Man of War, Harbinger. Those are fantastic. The books written by Jim Shooter were just so interesting on a few different levels.
Great artists too.
Great artists too.
Barry
David Lapham and others.
Yes,
Barry Windsor Smith.
David Lapham, an excellent creator. Absolutely.
So there's great stuff scattered throughout the decade, but it's all you just got to take some of the bad with the good, I guess.
Well, and honestly, you could say that about every decade. I mean, that's the thing. So the 90s and again, the 90s earned the knock because of it got too gimmicky, and the gimmicks got in the way of the good books that were out there. But also the distribution wars. And I'm glad to chronicle all that, because that was a major change in the business as well. Yeah,
that was a crushing experience for the entire industry. So, I mean, all of a sudden, basically, Marvel decided, I guess basically as part of Marvel's attempt to kind of control the entire comics world, they decided to distribute their comics through their own distributor instead of using multiple distributors. So before 1994 or so, there were up to a dozen different distributors in the country who would sell comics basically in regional areas. And Diamond and Capital City were the only two that sold nationally. In 94, Marvel decided they were going to buy a stake in a company called Heroes World, and Heroes World was just a small East Coast, mostly New York and Connecticut distributor, and so all their Marvel comics just through them. So they would cut off all the other distributors, and that caused everyone else to move to other distributors. So a handful of companies went to Capital City, but almost everyone went to Diamond. All of a sudden, the companies were fighting out who was going to be selling their books, and caused the industry to collapse even more. First of all, Heroes World had trouble fulfilling orders, and we have a great quote in the book, which unfortunately I don't have right at my fingertips. But basically, a retailer said, we never got anything for months. We never got anything from Marvel, so we just stopped selling Marvels. We started selling only DCs, and the industry, the readers realized they didn't care about the Marvel books as much.
Wow!
And then finally, everyone kind of coalesced around Diamond Comics, and that ended up taking off.
Yeah, and obviously it's a one distributor world today. Although I know there are some minor ones for certain art, more boutique publishers. I know that. I was talking to Art Baltazar before calling you, and he told me that again in this pre-Diamond exclusive world, he had 10 distributors when he was cranking out indie comics when he was really young and just starting in the business, and would do a 3,000 print run of a book, and they sold immediately because there were so many distributors when he first broke in, and that dried up obviously very quickly when everything kind of collapsed. Go on.
The industry lost about 25% of its market share just in the year or so while the distribution wars were going on. They were selling about 20 million copies per month, and it dropped to 16 million copies a month by the time that was all over with.
Wow.
And then within another year, it dropped another 4 million copies. I mean, just the sales numbers alone throughout the decade are incredible. At its peak in July 1993, there were 48 million copies sold per month. There was
month?
There was one month in particular where there was a $30 million day in November 1992 when Superman 75 came out.
Sure, yeah.
It lifted everything up in dead what's its name? The Image book, or not the Valiant book, not Bloodshot, sold 750,000 copies that day.
Wow.
By the end of the decade, so at the peak, we sold 48.2 million copies. By the end of the decade, 7 million copies were sold.
Jesus. Yeah, man.
It's just unbelievable.
Well, I know. I mean, I've talked to creators that lived through the boom and bust, and went through amazing royalty checks in the early '90s to, Mike Oeming is a classic example of that, who was getting a lot of work as an inker in the early part of the '90s, and then everything dried up, and he had to take a day job, and he was working in like the equivalent of like a toll booth, but it was in this like crazy like parking lot sort of like trucking kind of parking lot that he just had to be there for the trucks to like come in, turn in their manifests, get the new manifests and stuff. And he was just sketching, and that's when he changed his style to a more cartoony style, and he was friends with Bendis and Mack at that point. And that's when they kind of came up with the idea for Powers.
That's so cool.
Like, during the bust, and finally in '99 they put it out. But Mike is a classic, comic warrior that saw the early boom and then really kind of suffered for a couple of years and had to kind of reinvent himself. And thankfully, the market was back in an upswing in '99. Certainly not to where it was, back at the height. No. And I mean, like you said, million sellers in months, and now it's a triumph if there's 100,000 sellers.
Yeah, 100,000 is an amazing number. Roy Thomas said he made the most royalties of any time in his entire career from Secret Defenders #1. There's stories of Marvel sending Chris Claremont and John Romita Jr. an all-expense-paid trip to Paris at one point. There are stories of the Image founders who all created their own studios giving gifts to their employees that first year of sports cars for free because they were doing so well. I mean, these stories go on and on of just this incredible flood of money in the industry, and then it all just collapsed, like kind of overnight in a way. With stuff like the death of Superman, or the return of Superman, selling way below people's expectations, and the four different Supermans who return, and they expected to grab people's attention, but instead those books bombed. And
really,
of course,
those Reign of the Superman books bombed.
Well, they went down, down, down. But there was a tremendous interest right at the very beginning with Superman Returns. Then they kind of dragged those stories out for several months, and those books had steadily crushing sales, like drops of like 25% per month.
Wow, because I was hanging on every issue of that story. The one that I avoided and had no interest in was the Clone Wars, of course.
Oh my God!
And that's your classic failure story. Please, go on.
Oh, John, that was the most painful part of writing the whole book, was having to reread that stuff. God. Because that just went on.
There's great creators,
and on.
Man. Yeah, you're right. And even they say that part of it was, because of Marvel themselves going, no, we got to keep it going.
Yeah.
And even the writers in ours are like, I don't know if that's a good idea. And truly, like some really good friends of mine in the industry, guys like Alex Saviuk were like, some of the main artists and writers on that stuff. And it's like, that's the. Don't worry, we don't have to talk about that.
But no, I mean, it combines a whole bunch of different threads. So there's the internal Marvel politics, which was basically, we don't want to stop the Clone War because we're doing this Heroes Reborn thing, and it'll take people's attention away from Heroes Reborn. We want to keep this going because it seems to be generating sales. And actually, at the very beginning of that storyline, it actually spurred some sales on the Spider-Man book. For the first 3 or 4 months, when it seemed like it was going to lead to something, the sales actually went up. And then I think it was when basically Marvel decided that Peter Parker was the clone and not Ben Reilly, that people started getting legitimately angry at this at the storyline. And then sales started dropping like a stone, and there was all this fury about it. And those books are the biggest exercise in just treading water you can ever imagine. And that storyline was meant to be over in like 3 or 4 months, ended up lasting 2 years.
2 years. Oh my God.
You could see the passion though in that final issue of the story. I think it's Peter Parker Spider-Man 75. The art by John Romita Jr. just has so much passion in it, because you can tell he's just sick of this damn thing, and he just wants everything in it to be over, done with, characters to be dead, things to move on, and finally he gets to draw it. And like you could practically read it's like this giant sigh of relief, like, thank God I'm done with this stuff now.
So, are you able to pinpoint like what after the dust cleared and they had to kind of? I mean, there's a lot of downsizing going on, obviously. But did they reduce their amount? And I have to focus on the big two. I know a lot of companies obviously came and went in the 90s, and that's all chronicled. But for DC and Marvel, did they ever have to cut back on titles? And did they do things to kind of cut back because of the drop?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because during the peak of the boom, Marvel especially was publishing like 120 titles a month. It's just insanity. By the time, and Marvel has this whole other side story that we touch on also around their bankruptcy and around basically the investors at the time were grifters who were just trying to steal as much money out of Marvel as they possibly could.
Do you know the book? There's that great financial book that covers Carlisle.
Comic Wars by Dan Revive.
Yes, indeed.
Fascinating book.
Yeah, really, boy, there's your inside baseball of what happened and everything. And yeah, Carl Icahn and Ron Perlman and like you said, these robber barons that really came in and just gutted Marvel.
They didn't care at all about comics. I mean, Perlman especially just prided himself on having never read a comic, but yet they own this business where they had this conception that they are worth something, but really all they wanted to do was a business they could continually add more companies to. So they bought trading companies and sticker companies and other tangential businesses and just stuck them on the bottom line as a way of just continually growing market share. And even like, so you may remember, which was published by Malibu Comics in 93, 94.
Say it again, man. Every now and then you're dropping out. I'm not sure why.
Oh, I'm sorry. I might be leaning back from my phone as well, so I'll try to keep myself over the phone. I get excited talking about this stuff, as you can hear. So in 1993, a company called Malibu Comics, which was flush with money because they were the original co-publisher of Image Comics. And they were able to make like 10% a book off of the wholesale price.
God. Well, yeah, that
so they had this amazing windfall and then created their own comic line called Ultraverse. Ultraverse had characters like Prime, Mantra, Prototype, and others who you probably don't remember. Well, you might remember, but also classic quarter bin fodder. Long story short, at one point they decided they were going to try and sell their company. DC was courting them for a long time. They were doing some very systematic business arrangements with DC. Marvel catches wind of this potential sale and swoops in at the last moment, outbids DC for the books, and pays way more than they should be paying. Without getting too deep in the weeds, they paid way more than the actual business value of the titles. They buy the company, and then basically they bury the company. They publish a handful of comics that do poorly, and they say, well, in this case, we can't keep publishing them, and they kill the lines. They've invested millions of dollars in buying this company that they never do anything with. And the whole reason was to keep them away from DC because they were afraid if DC had bought Malibu and Ultraverse, they would pick up market share. And that's all that Marvel cared about. They didn't care about money. They just cared about market share, keeping the largest portion of the market share.
That's just crazy, man. And it shows you the pettiness of the time and everything. So just amazing.
Yeah, so this book isn't just all about business either. It's fun to talk about the back end side of this. I have a friend who teases me all the time. You care more about like what happened about comics than you do about comics themselves. But it's also fun to celebrate the actual work. You know,
absolutely. Yeah.
Whether it's rediscovering something like Neil Gaiman's Stardust or the Amalgam comics or the earliest Deadpool comics or even the maximum clonage of Spider-Man, all this stuff.
You're right.
It's just fun, right? And I was never really a big fan of stuff like the Onslaught saga, but now getting to read it again and having to kind of take a journalistic approach to it, there really is a lot of fun in those books. And so to me, it's been a great exercise also in just like having a reason to do kind of quarter bin diving and getting to rediscover a lot of fun stuff. And so a lot of what we try and do in this book is just bring out some of the fun in it that we had reading these books. Whether it's like the Valiant Comics reboot of 1998, which didn't sell at all, sold maybe 10,000 copies per issue, but it's just really fun. They did a different take on it. a Man of War that's very cool, or whatever it may be. It's just fun to dig into this stuff and kind of discover a lot of old favorites. I mean, we have well over 200 different illustrations in the book from some of the works that were published during the time that I think illustrates some of the key high levels, key points of the decade. And it's just, I think anyone reading this who even has a little interest in these books will have a great time reading the American Comic Book Chronicles.
Well, and I also think that people in their 40s and in their 30s, that was their decade, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And I'm probably screwing up my math right now, but I do know that people younger than me that are creators and stuff, Scotty Young is Scotty Young and Robert Kirkman, will be happy to tell you how much they love 90s comics. And I understand, because they were kids when that stuff was coming out. And yeah, man, the stuff that was coming out in your tween years, that's that's your favorite decade. I mean, I love a ton of 70s DC and Marvel that probably in rereads don't hold up. But again, it was, all new and exciting to me. So every comic book death or Justice League and Justice Society team up, these were major events, and they were very exciting. So I get it. So this is kind of like the perfect kind of volume to remember, and also, remind you of books that, kind of came and went. But that's the great thing. You really chronicle the history of not only the big sellers, but the gems, like you said, that, didn't make it. And then, were a fun run. But like I said, we're cut short for whatever reasons. So, it's an interesting time, and it's really good stuff.
It's great to rediscover stuff like Defiant Comics and Warriors of Plasm, those books that they put out. The early Valiant's wonderful too, but the early Vertigo books, getting to rediscover Sandman Mystery Theater from that era, for example.
Sandman Mystery
Theater. It's just a treat, right? Their Milestone comics, which are now pretty much forgotten, but there's just wonderful stuff that came out from that too. And I think it's interesting because Milestone, for example, debuted 26 years ago in February. And I think the people who would especially love a book like this as a Christmas gift are the people who are now hitting their mid to late 30s. And this stuff will just kind of resonate with you. It's just, but I think anyone who loves comics history will enjoy it too. I mean, I wrote the 70s book, as I mentioned, and we're rough contemporaries. So getting to write about that was just a lot of fun too, because it was great to bring back these old memories. And I was able to write a history that kind of showed my love for particular creators and times and works.
100%, man. Yeah.
But it was also really fun to be a little more objective and put together this interesting narrative story that pulls together the 90s in a way that I think has never been produced before. There's never been a book like this that kind of takes that decade, puts everything together, and gives you the larger context around what was happening, what some of the cool stuff is that you might be interested in reading, both from a mainstream standpoint and from an alternative standpoint.
I agree.
And get into some of the back end stuff too. So I didn't mean to turn this into an infomercial, but
no, man, it's okay. Hey, honestly, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you truly is because I tried during December to point out books and say, hey, this is a good idea if you're looking for a good Christmas gift. So I am happy to include the 90s Chronicle as one of those books. No, honestly, I truly do. So no, go ahead. Go for the infomercial, man.
That's all right. I think I've done enough. But yeah, any decade that gives us like the first issues of Hellboy can't be a bad decade.
Your Hellboy, Sandman, like you said, Preacher, Vertigo in general. No, it definitely got big numbers, and you give big numbers a shout out. A great collaboration between Alan Moore and Bill Sienkiewicz that never finished. Is Moore's those image books that he did they were kind of a parody of Marvel?
America's Greatest Comics, or you mean 1963?
Yes. 1963 was what I was thinking of.
Yeah, those are so fun too. Yeah,
in the book, covered in the book.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Very
and in fact, Moore specifically put together those books for two reasons. One is he just wanted to have fun and write something that was really kind of not deep and thoughtful. Yeah. The other is he knew he was going to make so much money from them that he wanted to bring in some of his favorite independent comics creators and have them have a nice windfall.
Yes, Rick Veitch was in there. Yeah, who else? Give us some
exactly. Steve Bissette, John Tuttleman. oh my God, now I'm spacing on his name. The guy who did Yummy for Chester Brown. They were all
Chester
in
Brown,
those
sure.
books, and
Yeah.
all made like more money than they really ever made in their entire career from this kind of 6-issue pastiche of Marvel Comics with Mystery Incorporated, The Fury, Tales from Beyond, Tales of the Uncanny, Horus, Lord of Light, and the Tomorrow Syndicate. Like, okay, there's some one-shot characters, but like there's so much passion and energy and fun in those books that they sold like crazy.
Well, and as you say, a precursor to what was to come later, because he would put in the equivalent of like Stan's soapbox, and he was Affable Al, I remember as
Affable Al, exactly.
Affable Al Moore. And it's like, yeah, that's great, man. And then, the plan was to do a kind of dystopian final issue that never actually saw the light of day. And I know Rick Veitch has written in detail about, what it was supposed to be and his view of why everything collapsed. And it's a shame, because that was a fun, like you said, throwaway thing. And a lot of the ideas that he did as far as back matter, as the phrase has been coined since, wound up in like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Right, which also came out in 1999. So that's part of the kind of sudden boom that we saw in 99 was League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Tom Strong, Top 10, all those books that Moore put out through American's Greatest Comics that were like these unexpectedly just fun books. Prometheus, of course, the one that's most critically acclaimed. But all that whole line was kind of birthed in this whole 1963 concept where he just kind of was rediscovering his deep passion for his childhood loves.
Yeah,
I love this. I love this line too that Moore talks about. He imagined that line as a quote alternative future for the comics industry. He wanted them to be a certain type of heroism that comics had moved away from during the 90s, and bringing back like pure heroes, as well as this kind of imaginative concepts he brought in for Promethea. And so like you could see one of the things we like to do in the book is also tell this arc of these creators and the work they produce, and you could really see this arc of like Moore started with 1963 and being obviously dissatisfied with the nature of comics at that time. And by 99, he'd kind of worked through those issues, put out the wonderful work he did on Supreme in 98 and 97, and then worked it through to these to books like Tom Strong and Top 10 by 99. That really became this kind of fulfillment of the whole ethos he was trying to push.
Agreed. No, I love that stuff. And friends with some of his collaborators like Gene Ha on Top 10, and Splash Brannigan was Hilary Barta, and it was kind of a kind of a Plastic Man homage in a lot of ways. Those are terrific books. I have Jack B. Quick with Kevin Nolan, and
Nolan, that amazing artwork. Yeah,
beautiful stuff. Absolutely, man, and great ideas. Really, really great concepts. No, like you said, man, there's a lot of gold in the 90s, and there's a lot of crap as well. But but again, that's what makes the Comic Book Chronicles so much fun. And I really every decade, again, if you're interested in any of these decades, and like I said, I'm going to have to go back and check out your work on the 70s and on the 80s as well. I'm particularly interested in the DC implosion. I know I bought a book about the DC implosion. I haven't really got through it yet.
Actually, my editor, Keith Dallas, also worked on the DC Implosion book, and his collaborator wrote the 1960s volumes for the American Comic Book Chronicles.
Oh, that's cool. Excellent.
So it's all within the family.
No, honestly, and, I'm a huge Twomorrows fan, man. I truly, I always buy Alter Ego and Back Issue in particular, and I eventually will have Michael Urey on to talk about Back Issue. I've talked to Roy about Alter Ego. And,
Roy's the best too. Just love that guy.
You know what happened? Why did Amazing Heroes? Because I know it ended in the 90s. Why did Fantagraphics stop doing Amazing Heroes?
So my first job in the industry was actually at Amazing Heroes.
Oh, no kidding!
I worked for them for about 3 years or so. If you look at any of the last 30 or so issues, you'll see freelance work I did for them. It was simple, actually. The sales were just declining. Wizard was eating our lunch by the time Amazing Heroes got canceled, and there's just the price guide combined with the flashiness of the art and the slickness of the paper was just something Fantagraphics couldn't compete with.
Sure.
So it's just that simple.
Yeah, I understand. Boy, that's a shame, because I'll tell you, I was of all the great comic magazines, Comics Interview, and of course, Wizard and the like. Amazing Heroes was always my favorite, and it's funny. I even remember finding and taking a picture with my camera and sending to Bendis. When he was a kid, he did a Superboy illustration that wound up in one of the issues, and it's like, oh yeah,
That might have been in one of my issues, actually. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The interview. If you remember the interview with Dave Sim that ran at, I think, number 201, that was my interview.
Oh, that's great, man. No, and I mean, I've talked to Mark Waid about his work in Amazing Heroes, and didn't Busick used to do essays as well?
Yeah, he did some work for it, I believe, before my time on the project.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. And I mean, I started reading it in the 80s. Well, and again, that's why the 90s is really an interesting time, and you point that out as well, that it was coming off of the black and white boom of the 80s, and that's I'm assuming it was the 80s that the direct market really took off. I know it predated the 80s and in certain cities, and we had specialty stores in Chicago and stuff, but it really seemed like the 80s was the decade where, and in fact I think you even say that in the introduction of the book, that's when the publishing focus went away from the newsstand and really focused into the specialty stores. We talk about that a lot in the 1970s book, actually, because that all started in 1978 and 79. Okay.
Spurred by Jim Shooter talking to Chuck Rosansky, who sued what that time was Seagate Distribution for having exclusive distribution rights in America, which is a little ironic considering how the story played out. And that created the birth of the direct market. For two reasons. One is that we suddenly got many more distributors scattered all around the country. And then many of those distributors started their own comic book companies. So Pacific Comics from the early 1980s came from Pacific Comics Distribution. Capital Comics, who first published Nexus and Badger, came from Capital City Distribution. Malibu, who I just mentioned, came from Sunrise Distribution. And so there was this kind of natural synergy where this all evolved out of it. So really because the market opened up in the late 1970s, then we had the boom in the early 1980s, and then an even bigger boom in 1986, 87 around the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which was this massive boom and bust cycle that happened very quickly where because the Turtles was just this overwhelming success, which is a great story just by itself. There's a book just in the rise and fall of Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird and the Turtles. The market boomed and then busted, and then the first Batman movie came out, and that then triggered another boom in the industry. And then just as that was kind of starting to peter out, that's when the comics industry started really growing. And in fact, basically it's in the shadow of the Batman movie that Spider-Man #1 comes out by McFarlane, because McFarlane was feeding off the fan enthusiasm from the people who had moved into comics because they loved the Batman movies so much. So it all kind of feeds on itself, because then that spurs the rise of Image with incredible boom in the industry, and all of a sudden, although the entire cycle just kind of flows through itself again. So it's interesting how if you see the longer view, it's basically boom, bust,
Sure.
And a long bust, and it's all tied together.
It is interesting, too, that, as you say, because of the success of the 89 Batman movie, it did bring people to the comic stores. And I know that's the classic frustration right now with all the success of the movies and the television. And it's like, how come they're not coming to the stores? Now, obviously, if they are for Walking Dead, Walking Dead certainly translated into more sales for Robert and everything. So in that case, it worked. But it is interesting that, we haven't had that, the wave coming back to the shore after, the big success of the movies and TV.
Yeah, that's the most interesting thing to me, is that we never had the spur in sales after the first Batman movie. There's just something special about that movie for some reason, maybe in the hype, that captured people's attention. Marvel came out with not Marvel, but when the Blade movie came out in 98, I believe.
Yes.
And it was a runaway hit. I mean, people forget how revolutionary that was. But it was a completely unexpected hit too. And Marvel wasn't even really ready to sell Blade comics. They didn't do any effort to cross over and build sales based on it. Yeah, 98 was a big hit.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, because people always credit 99 for the Spider-Man and X-Men movies, and it's like, no, it started with Blade. And that was a huge hit. And also the same missed opportunity in 99 with X-Men. I remember they had the opportunity to put in comic pages in TV Guide, and they had it in, whatever mid-story that was completely impenetrable for somebody just walking in and going, oh, I like the X-Men movie. Maybe I would like the comic. And it was, like this middle story scene that did nothing in terms of helping them promote. And it's like, oh, you idiots. What a classic opportunity when TV Guide still mattered and was such a high-selling magazine to possibly get people interested. And, well, that's why those brilliant people that failed with Blade and X-Men were on the way out and made room for Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti with Marvel Knights and Gemis and the new regime of Marvel in the 2000s.
Yeah, absolutely. The entire industry turned over basically because of Marvel Knights. And, Marvel Knights was just an experiment, too. I mean, during that time, so Marvel did Heroes Reborn, which was basically giving their main characters to the image creators. And they reached out to all the image creators, and only Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld took on the characters. After that, they reached out to other companies as well. Chaos Comics put out a 5-issue Halloween-based miniseries as kind of a pilot for them to do a line of comics for Marvel. Marvel actually had a contract in hand with a Filipino company that was going to put out a line of like 30 comics in 98 and 99 that fell through. And Marvel Knights was just another attempt to kind of grab at that kind of cherry, which was, just to have work kind of farmed out to other creators. And that just happened to be the one that caught people's attention and really was well hyped. And a lot of it was Kevin Smith on Daredevil, which to people outside the industry was like, oh my God, Kevin Smith's doing comics.
Yep.
How is this a thing? And then and then they got hooked into the line and hooked into the cool stuff that was happening in comics at the time.
Yeah, it was great stuff, Marvel Knights, absolutely. And I've had conversations with Quesada and Palmiotti about that amazing line and the people they gathered, and finally got to talk to Christopher Priest about it, too, just a few months ago. So,
that Black Panther run is so good.
Absolutely, man. No. And they really had to, kind of shake fans and say, look, this is – I mean, I remember the ads, and it was like, hey – Black Panther's really, really good right now. You should be reading it. And thankfully it holds up because I think a lot of now with the success of the movie, they've been putting the trades out again and everything. And it's like, yeah, that stuff, I mean, it's a little different than today's comics, but I think it's readable enough. And it seems to me that I've met enough people that have read it for the first time and like, oh, this is really good. And it's like, yeah.
I don't think they would have had the Black Panther movie without those trades, without those comics.
I agree with you. No, absolutely, man. It's and again, it's going to be. Are there plans at Twomorrows to do the first decade of the 2000s?
Yeah, that's come up a few times in interviews. If there is, I'm not going to be writing it. Writing the 90s book was a lot of work. It took me almost 4 years to write this thing.
Wow.
It's 180,000 words to run. I actually did I have almost 3,000 scans we prepped for the book. So yeah, it was a lot of stuff. I want to just move on to other things in my life. I know the next volume that's coming out is the first half of the 1940s. So we're going to do a 2-volume set on the 40s. And that'll complete the entire history from 1940 to 1999.
That's fantastic. And it makes sense to do 2 volumes for the 40s because there really was the war years and then the post-war years. So I can appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating era, too, of course. About as different from the 90s you could possibly get.
Oh, absolutely. My God.
But Kurt Mitchell, who's done a number of books on comic history as well as writing for Alter Ego, is working on that book. I had lunch with him not too long ago, and he's very excited about it and very deep into the research on it. It's fascinating, actually, to hear how hard it is for him to find his source material. For me, it's a lot of quarter bin diving. For him, it's a lot of hard research.
Did you reach out to creators or publishers as well and get interviews with them?
So that's an interesting part of this because that's a rule I made for myself at the beginning was to do as few new interviews as possible.
Interesting. Why?
Because people's memories get distorted over time.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So if you hear any of the interviews with like the original Image founders, they talk about it basically predestined that they would be a success. But there's so much press from the era, from the time that shows like what people were actually thinking. That like it's much more interesting to say, well, we're going to read interviews and say, we're going to take this chance. What's the worst that'll happen? We'll go back to Marvel. Well, they would never admit that they said that, but it's in an issue of Hero Illustrated or whatever. And you're never going to get that freshness. There's this awesome interview with Rob Liefeld from 97 where he's talking, basically Image came together in 92, and then by 97 they were all fighting each other. They're trying to kick Rob out, and then Mark Silvestri left for a while, and there was all this kind of big battling and stuff. And there's this great interview with Liefeld in an issue of the Amazing Heroes by Comics Journal, by Hart Fisher, who was also kind of an interesting character in comics history. And Fisher has Liefeld basically saying, "Yeah, I know I screwed this up. I made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I just have to live with it." That's like, you're never going to find him saying that now, but at the time, this is where his mindset was. It's just very fun to kind of dig into that whole side of thing and really see what people's thoughts were. So we did some modern interviews. I interviewed, for example, one of the co-creators of Malibu Comics, and that's where I got the inside story about the Marvel deal. Actually talked to Jim Shooter about his time in the decade, partially for this book, partially for another book I have out called Jim Shooter Conversations. It's through University Press in Mississippi. And he gave a lot of interesting inside scoop on the four different companies he worked on in the 90s. Valiant, Broadway, Defiant.
Valiant, Broadway, go on. Valiant, Broadway.
Actually, there's three: Valiant, Defiant, and Broadway.
Oh, Defiant was right. That was the third one. Okay.
Yeah, and crazy stories about that. How they released the first issues of Plasm as a trading card set. Because the trading card company had invested in their company, and so they had to produce the first issue as a trading card set, and they had these binders to collect the trading cards, but the binders production was late, so they invested $1 million in producing these cards, and they sold barely anything, and then the whole company was sabotaged by Marvel. We get into this in very deep detail in the book, and it's also fascinating just how like small and nasty the industry was at the time.
Understood. And no, that's great, because I know I read the Howard Chaykin Conversations book from a few years ago. So that's great, man. Oh, I'll have to pick up your other book. That's excellent. I would love to read that. No, absolutely. And Shooter is one of those guys I haven't had the opportunity yet to talk to. So I'm going to have to make that happen sooner than later.
He was fascinating. He was fascinating.
No doubt. Oh, my God, a guy that's been in the business since he was 13 years old. Good Lord.
Yeah.
If not 12. Whenever he started writing those Legion comics when he was a little kid.
He was 15. And
I thought he was younger than even 15, but you're probably right.
No, it was just dumb luck that he got the job too, because like he wrote a letter to Mort Weisinger saying, "I can do better than these stupid Legion of Superhero comics," and like Weisinger, who's like this famous ogre. Yes. Psychopath is a great word for it, dude. Seriously.
I've talked to people who've worked for him. I understand. Go on.
Shooter tells the story over and over again. He's 15 years old, or at this point 16 when he really started writing for him. And at that time, the Batman TV show was on twice a week. And Weisinger would call Shooter every Thursday after the end of the second Batman episode. That
right, the finish to the cliffhanger. Yeah.
And Shooter would pick up the phone, and his hands would be trembling, and he'd be sitting in his parents' kitchen. And mind you, his dad had trouble finding work at that time, and so the family was depending on his income to pay the freaking mortgage.
Yeah, in Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh, right? Yeah, because his dad was a steel worker who got caught in a bunch of labor disputes and had just trouble keeping a job. So Shooter's getting these calls, and Weisinger's berating him. "You're the worst. You're a terrible writer. You can't write comic books. I can't believe you're so terrible." And then and so Shooter says, like, for years I had a pathological fear of talking on the telephone.
Wow.
At the same time, Weisinger is going to his fellow editors and saying, "You won't believe how good my kid is. This kid is amazing. He's the best writer I have in my stable." But it's just his way of abusing Shooter. Which explains so much about how he approaches the world and his whole attitude towards his creative work. That was just a fascinating book.
I bet, man. No, that's interesting, and yeah, you're right. Good Lord, the guy's a teenager, and he's writing The Death of Pharaoh Lad, which is one of the classic Silver Age Legion stories, things like that.
Absolutely.
I read all that stuff in reprints, in 80-page giants and 100-page spectaculars. And they were great stories. They're wonderful stories. And like you said, I mean, he really made an impact with Valiant and also Marvel. I mean, I know just as many creators that didn't like working with Jim that did. There's about half and half. I know Gene Colan was never a fan of Gene's. And I
No, he
had that
wasn't.
conversation before dear Gene passed away. So
No, he wasn't. No, there was a lot of hatred there. Yeah, Shooter's definitely the most controversial character that I ever written about. He, of course, is the hero of his own story, and no one will ever tell him otherwise. I guess we all are.
Yeah, and also, hey, man, there are people that are these type A personalities, but then they have the talent to back it up.
Yeah,
and it's like, well, I'm a great writer and I'm a great editor, and it's like, well, given your body of work, yeah, you are. So it's hard to disagree with that,
There was high quality in all the comics he put out in the 90s. I'll tell you that much. The early Image books, and there's a great story where he worked something like 500 days in a row. Working for Valiant. He worked 500 days in a row at Valiant. He worked Christmas, he worked New Year's, he worked every single day. He tells a story where he was never able to get a haircut because he was so busy working on the damn comics. He paid so much attention to the detail. He tells this cute little anecdote of he once had a guy call him up in the evening on Christmas night saying, "Hey, I need to talk to you about this project. Sorry for calling you on Christmas." And Shooter's like, "Come on down to the office. I'm still here." Like, wow, there's devotion. Wow. And then one of the most interesting stories in the book is why he left Image, or why he left Valiant. I don't know why I keep making that same mistake. Sorry, listeners. Because I literally heard 5 different stories about why he left Valiant Comics. Shooter tells the story. As Shooter tells the story, his business partner was named Steve Masarski, who is the talent agent for, among others, the Doobie Brothers and Cyndi Lauper. The test of your age. Anyone under the age of 20 or age of 35 won't have any idea who I'm talking about. And as Shooter tells the story, Masarski was having an affair with the accountant at the company, and they conspired to push him out. As other people tell it, Shooter was asking for an outrageous percentage of the value of the characters and some IP against them, and they pushed him out because he was being completely unreasonable. And all we can do in the book, because we have these completely unreconcilable differences, is just to list all these different stories. And frankly, it's a lot of fun to list all these different stories, because then we're leaving it to you to decide. I don't know what to believe. I just think it's interesting.
Absolutely, man. No. I hear what you're saying, and it sounds like you get the same kind of fascination and joy out of interviewing and putting together your books in the same way that I try to with Word Balloon. And like you said, and I'm glad it makes sense in terms of researching this book, and you'll get more candid interview, or at least candid point of views about what the people were thinking at the time. And that's what I love so much about Amazing Heroes and Wizard at its best, and all these other magazines that Comics Interview, David Kraft's book, wasn't it? David Anthony Kraft?
Comics Interview, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, and truly that's what I try to do with Word Balloon is, if you want to know what Jeff Johns, when they were making 52, listen to this episode of Word Balloon, and he's talking about it. And, yeah, I mean, that's the great thing, and I know that a handful of the creators have told me that's why they appreciate what I try to do, because I just want that platform. And also, I'm a lazy writer. I wrote for boxing magazines and sports magazines in the late 80s and through the mid 90s. And I am the living embodiment of was it Dorothy Parker that said, "I hate writing but love having written."
Yes.
And
God.
And again, I hear the relief of this book being finished after your 4 years of labor. Believe me, man, I understand. It is tough to commit to write for myself, and so I can appreciate the feeling of, all right, it's done. Now can I go on to something else? But it's I'm glad you're out there, man, because I know you're doing great work, and forgive me, is Comics Bulletin still around, or is it no longer?
I left the site about 2.5 years ago, so I still do a little bit of freelancing for them. But I'm mostly concentrating on books. So I have 3 other books in different stages of production. 2 more for the Conversation series for University Press of Mississippi. One on Steve Gerber that's going to come out in late 2019. Wow. And the second on Don McGregor. Speaking of Black Panther.
Oh, that's great, man. Oh, Jesus. And when I got to talk to Priest, I did a Black Panther panel at Terrificon in Connecticut in August. And
cool.
Where, so that was my, finally, I've been trying to get Don for years. And, but that was
Don is a treat. Don is such a character.
Hilarious.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And the same with Chris. I mean, Priest is amazing, and yeah, I mean, I just have such respect for those guys. So no, that's great. Hey, when all those books are ready, you're certainly welcome back because
thank you.
Absolutely, man. No, like I said, I love the Chaykin book. I don't know who wrote it for them, if you know.
Oh gosh, I don't know.
But that was a terrific book that they put out as well. And no, it's like Citizen Kane. You know the reference, but yeah, I mean, you get all these different, just like you were saying about the deal with, you know, how things fell out with Shooter and everything. No, it's interesting assembling all the different points of view from a certain incident. And yeah, I mean, you know, again, it's up to the reader to decide where the truth is in all of the different variances of everyone's point of view and how things hashed out. So, and man, Gerber's a fascinating guy. And McGregor's a fascinating guy. So those are the two. And what's the third one? Did you say the third one?
And then it's probably a little premature for me to talk about, but I'm thinking of doing some oral histories as well.
Terrific. That's great, man. Hey.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's like I said. It's as opposed to writing. That's what I do here at Word Balloon.
Yeah.
And I'm all for more. The great thing is, man, I don't like. Believe me, not a competitive bone in my body. I want more good podcasts where people are having good comic book conversations. And Dave Harper is a guy who out in Alaska is doing off panel, and he's doing great. He's doing great one-on-one interviews with comic creators. So no, we need more. So please, Jason, come join us in the pool. It's okay.
Yeah, it'll be called Classic Comics Cavalcade. It's probably I have 5 podcasts in the can already, and I want to get about 10 built up first. I'll be running some classic interviews as well as some new interviews and narrative type work, as well as just whatever kind of sparks my imagination, because the whole idea is to just kind of share my love for comics. I feel like we've lived parallel lives, John.
Absolutely, man. No, this has been a great pleasure getting to meet you, and yeah, we're running in the same milieu, and and like I said, that's great because. Well, again, I'm sure we have our own little different idiosyncratic ways of, and our own, well, and it's just our own curiosities, our own personal curiosities. And so, like I said, yeah, I'm cool with that. It's okay. It's like, no, a bunch of us can talk to Howard Chaykin. A bunch of us can talk to, you know, Don McGregor or you know, name any creator. Denny O'Neil. I've been bothering him for an entire year this past year. And he's been very gracious coming back a couple times. So, no, it's great, man. And truly, yeah, when you're ready with that project and the books, you're always welcome back. But for our purposes today, it's I want to get the title right. I've got it here. American Comic Book Chronicles, the 90s. It's published by Twomorrows, and Jason Sachs is your author. So good job, man. Excellent book. Again, definitely on the Christmas list for people. You should definitely check it out. And great conversation. Happy to have you back.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. Another great episode available today. Dennis Kitchen talking about the history of underground comics. And February is already jam-packed with a lot more great word balloon conversation. Still got to get to my good friend Chris Iliopoulos, who I did a great conversation with. That'll be coming up in February. Also some other old friends coming back and new people as well. So I hope you'll join me for a wonderful February as we continue into 2019 here on Word Balloon. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2019.